Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me again. If you were here yesterday, you know we began looking at verse 12, and I read all the way to verse 13 in Proverbs chapter 6, where Solomon is talking about the individual he calls the scoundrel or the villain. Now, I grew up seeing scoundrels as being guys like Whipley Snodlass, who would go around, ripping off people and being the bad guy. He had a long black curly mustache and a black hat, black clothes, so it was easy to identify him because he was the bad guy. But the simple fact was that he was always scheming to do something that was dishonest or wrong and taking advantage of other people. And that's still a fairly good way of defining it, what a scoundrel is, or even what a villain is, because there's a person who has an agenda that's designed to solely benefit them, and the more harm they do you, the more pleasure they find in that. Now, I granted that's a very twisted way of looking at life and looking at other people, but there are some people who have such a reservoir of unresolved anger and bitterness in their heart that they can't help but kind of interact with the rest of mankind. You find that if a man's a thief, he suspects everybody as being a thief. If a man's a liar, he's always accusing someone else of being a liar. And I think even when we listen to some of the political discourse that goes on, that the people who often accuse other people are guilty of the very thing that they themselves are doing. It's kind of the idea they're going to destroy democracy, and they say that even as they're saying that, they're engaged in activities that will ultimately destroy democracy. And so that tells us that there's a scoundrelousness about them, a scoundrel spirit that has really taken hold of their person. And he said there are certain, markers in the way that they behave. And that's where he picks up the conversation again in verse 12, where he says that first of all, we look at their words. He said, they go about with corrupt mouths. And what corrupt mouth means is it's a double-tongued voice. In other words, you can't believe what they're saying. The old saying we used to have is they speak out of both sides of their mouth. In other words, they have a way of basically saying things that aren't true because they think it will be for their advantage. And they never really calculate down the road that they might be found out. I think that's what's making it more difficult, maybe more embarrassing for many of the professional liars we have in our culture today, because we have video recordings of people saying one thing and then changing their position completely and pretending like they didn't hold the previous position. I mean, it's the kind of thing that drives people crazy. And when I talk with a lot of people who are having really high frustration levels, that dealing with people who are perpetually pathologically dishonest is something that really drives us crazy. And I'll have to talk about how we manage that a little further on, because it's really important we do. One of the things that Solomon warns later on, he says that injustice drives a good man crazy. That's my paraphrase. And I've found that to be true. I found that sometimes I'm watching somebody saying something that I know obviously is not true. And worse yet, I know that they know it's not true, but they're saying it anyway. And you find yourself beginning to boil over and get all upset. And suddenly you begin to display the same kind of anger and resentment that they're talking about, when in fact we should really begin praying for them and praying for pity, because God says their words will come back and get them. But let me get back to where I am so I don't get too far ahead of myself. He says one of the things you look at, not only at their words, but their body language. It's interesting because when I watch people being interviewed a lot of times, especially if it's kind of an aggressive interview where they're being challenged on what they're saying, the way people react tells us whether or not they're truth tellers or whether they're being untruthful. In other words, one of the things he says is they wink with their eyes. And it's interesting because if you watch a person's eyes when you're talking to them, if they make direct eye contact with you, that's an indicator, not perfect, but an indicator they're probably telling you the truth. But if they blink a lot or don't blink at all, then there's a good chance that they're not being completely truthful. Now, in the passage, he says in verse 13, who winks with his eyes, he's referring to basically signaling his cohorts that he's doing something deceptive, something misleading, almost like is part of the game, that he's getting away with something. But I think, again, it's a general indicator that the eyes don't lie. In fact, have you ever noticed that sometimes people have a picture and there's a smile on their face, but their eyes aren't smiling? Do you know that we actually do smile with our eyes? Whether we're actually smiling or laughing or feeling good about something, it becomes reflective in our eyes in very subtle ways that almost everybody intuitively can pick up. But I've talked to people who are smiling and trying to come across as being very friendly, but I can feel so much aggression behind their eyes that I'm not deceived by the smile that they're showing, because their eyes say they're not happy, they're not lying, and their eyes can say, I'm angry with you and I don't like you and I want to harm you. Secondly, he says they signal with their feet. Have you ever noticed when a person is being interviewed and they got their legs crossed and their one foot is bouncing up and down real fast like that? That's an indication of a person who's very, very nervous. Again, our body begins to indicate what's going on. We're not at peace with what we're saying. We're not at peace with the situation. Now, a bouncing foot doesn't necessarily mean you're a liar, but it means that you're very uncomfortable in the conversation and the circumstance that you find yourself in, which may be possibly because you're not becoming completely truthful, or maybe you're withholding some information that in your conscience is telling you, I actually should share this. And then the third thing, he says they motion with their fingers. They signal their cohorts with various gestures, but it's interesting to me because I talk a lot with my hands. And I hope they're illustrative. But when I see people talking to me and their fists are really clenched, or their hands are quivering, or their hands are shaking, obviously the adrenaline that's running through their body is beginning to express itself through their hands. So all of this is something that we would help ourselves if we become cognizant of it. And I don't mean that when you're in conversation, you're just kind of scoping somebody out. But these kind of things become kind of overt. When you're talking with somebody who's being honest, they usually make normal eye contact with you. They'll look you in the eye, but they'll blink accordingly, not real fast, not real often. But oftentimes when people are not telling the truth, they'll look at you and then they'll look away. And there's something about our inner heart that can't lie, can't deceive. And it'll show up again in the other ways through our hands and our feet and other motions. But he goes on to say in verse 14, that what they're actually up doing, what their motive is they're plotting evil with deceit in his heart. Now, when we read the word plot, sometimes we come to the effect of, well, shouldn't I have a plan? And a plot is not necessarily the plan. In other words, we even talk about how we watch a movie or a play, some kind of dramatic presentation, and we say, what is the plot? In other words, what is the storyline? That's not being nefarious. It's not being deceitful or dishonest, but it means that we have an idea of where we want to start and where we want to end. And he's saying what these people do, they have a plan. They want to start someplace and they want to end someplace, but they're evil. It is an evil intent. In other words, they want to take advantage of you. And secondly, they're going to do it by not telling you the truth, by withholding key information. And that's why it's not impolite to ask questions and to inquire of people. In ministry, we have people all the time who would like to serve in various capacities, and we really appreciate it because without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. But yet part of the process is for us to interview them and have them fill out forms and background checks and so forth, especially if they're working with children, but to find out who are they? Because we're meeting them maybe for the first time or only have a very superficial, casual relationship, but who are they historically? What's their track record? Now, some people say, you can't judge me because of my past. And I have to ask you what you mean by that statement, because judge your worth as a person? No. Judge your importance to God? No. But can I judge your character as it's been displayed over a period of time? I can. Now, have you changed that character? You've come to Christ and God is working in you? Well, that should become evident as well, because Jesus put it very simply. He said, we judge a tree by its fruits. We don't judge a tree by the things we claim for ourselves. We don't judge a tree by what somebody else has told us about something. But basically, we do try to look at what is the fruit of their life. What is the trajectory? Because the interesting thing about fruit is that fruit is the consequence of the root. In other words, whatever the tree is by its root is what it will produce in terms of its fruit. If the root is good, Jesus said, then good fruit will come. If the root is evil, then evil things will come. And so that's why, again, it's we're not called to judge people's salvation or their worth or their value or their importance. But as a friend of mine put it one time, he said, but we are called to be fruit inspectors. And having grown up in Central California, where we raised a lot of and harvested a lot of fruit, one of the things that we found when we worked in factories was you had fruit coming down the conveyor belt, and you were supposed to go through the fruit and pick out the stuff that was unhealthy, rotten, or whatever, wasn't able to be displayed for sale. You pick the rotten stuff out to make sure that it didn't infect the good stuff, because that's one of the things that happen. If you have a bad tomato and it's in a bunch of healthy tomatoes, that rot will begin to spread to the other tomatoes and ruin the whole box. So it's the same idea that when you allow people of bad character, perverted character, to get into positions of influencing and touching the lives of other people, that always will produce a very negative consequence in their life and really in the life of the community of believers. Well, still got more to say, so tomorrow we'll continue this conversation. God bless you and go in His grace.